Hello, I'm Stephen Asher, the creator of the Cyclete. Today I'm going to give you a more intimate look at the components that make up our rear wheel assembly. At the core is our thru-axle crank and our belt side crank arm that are separable. They go together and separate, allowing the rear wheel to be removed more easily. I'm going to show you how these components go together. So we start with the thru-axle portion, and we put just a little bit of Loctite on these threads, and we put our adjusting collar. This has a left-hand thread. We're going to roll that all the way onto the shaft. This will later be used to take up the slack between the bearings on the hub. Next, we apply some of our white lightning grease to the oversized square tapers. Then we place our right crank. You'll see that there's a R right here, perhaps. Our right-hand crank goes on the chain side. And we're going to place this into our handy floor jack clamp. And we'll take our right side crank bolt. It doesn't have a hole in it, the other side does. And we're going to put a little grease on the back. A little Loctite on the threads. And then we will torque this crank bolt to 54 foot-pounds. And that'll pull the square tapers nice and snug against each other. And we hold this down on the crank bolt to ensure that it doesn't slip off. There we go. 54 foot-pounds. Then we'll flip this over. We'll place our bearing housing for the right side onto the axle. We're going to add a liberal amount of grease, or white lightning grease, to the flats and to the axle. This is important to ensure proper assembly and to ensure that it will loosen when you do pull the thru axle out. And then when you reassemble, you should add new grease. We'll put just a drop of Loctite on the threads. And then we'll take our wheel and place it onto the thru axle. So our wheel has a hub that is made under license from SRAM. It's the world's first 15mm thru-axle hub, and by making that, we make that ourselves to facilitate our design here. Next, we're going to place the belt side of this axle on. And we're going to add the bearing housing for the left side. We're going to add a collar. We'll place some Loctite on the threads. going to snug this down. And this assembly, this side of this assembly, stays on the bike and isn't taken apart unless you need to service the bearings. You can service the belt sprocket. And the important thing is that this remains on the bike, or on the Cyclete. It's not a bike, it's a Cyclete. When doing maintenance on the wheel, so that the belt is not disturbed. The tension on the belt is not disturbed. Okay, now we add some grease to these flats. Be careful not to put any grease on the threads above it. And we put our crank on. Okay, now we're going to, this blue high-strength bolt is what connects the two systems to each other. We're going to put a little bit of grease on the shoulder and under the head of the bolt. And this bolt you don't normally see because it's going to be under the other crank bolt. But when you loosen this bolt through the crank bolt, it self-extracts. So we're going to tighten this bolt to 28 foot-pounds, and that snugs up our left and right crank axles. Then we'll place this crank bolt that does have a hole. That hole is there to access this bolt underneath it. So we're going to put a little bit of grease on that just to make the tightening of it reach the torque that's required. And then we'll put a little bit of blue Loctite on the threads. And we'll again tighten this to 54 foot-pounds. And then the last step, you'll note that there's a little bit of play in the hub on the axle. And so we're going to flip this over and adjust the nut, the collar, on the other side. This is also done when you remove the wheel. You'll loosen this nut and then you retorque it. So we're going to, again, this has a left-hand thread, so we're going to be turning it in the counterclockwise direction, and we'll use that to snug up the wheel. And now, there we go, I turned it the wrong way. So we're turning it in the left-hand counterclockwise direction. And we'll snug that up. And now there's no play in the wheel. So there you have it. That is our crank axle passing through the rear wheel that is separable. I'm going to show you how that separates. So on the Cyclete, you're able to, with loosen this one bolt, make sure it's seated fully into the bolt, and then we can separate it. And as we unscrew it, it pushes the cranks apart, and then it will leave the You'll turn it until the bolt is fully loosened. And there you have it. So this assembly then stays on the cyclete. The wheel can be removed. And there you have your two axles come apart with that one bolt. And to reassemble it, the wheel goes back in. You put the through axle through the wheel. And reapply your grease. Place the crank back on, and then you'll start turning the bolt in, and you'll feel the bolt catch. You'll hold the crank so that they're facing in the right direction, and come together. And tighten it again to 28 foot-pounds. So there you have it. The through-axle crank arm. That's the magic of the Cyclete component rear end. Okay. Happy trails.